The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Chapter 59. The Eclipse King is Cursed by the Marshal. Talosheim's total fighting strength was quite different now compared to the time when Vandaloo was just approaching his third birthday. Vandaloo himself had grown strong, but more importantly, those around him had also grown stronger as a whole. The only ghouls remaining at rank 3 were workers like Taria and those of the newly born generation. Most of the rest, including those like Bilde and Kachia, had become rank 4 individuals with race titles such as warriors, grapplers, archers, and little mages. Many had reached rank 5, becoming ghoul barbarians, ghoul heavy warriors, and ghoul grappler adepts. They were developing incredibly quickly compared to regular ghouls. Though the undead titans had developed very little in the past 200 years, they were now commuting to the dungeons day and night, and most of them had at least increased their ranks by 1. Braga and the others were also developing at a hectic pace. In addition to them, the third city wall was a stone golem, and cemetery bees had doubled in number. And though they could only be used in a defensive battle, due to their limited mobility, there were around 100 immortal Ents. Those who could be called Vandaloo's personal guard don't even need to be mentioned. There was one girl who raised her beloved mace, refusing to be overshadowed by the others. "You can't do that." "Huh?" "Even if you make that surprised face, you can't," Vandaloo said to Pavina, who was holding a stone mace that he had made for her after she had pestered him.
I'm not a kid anymore."
"No, you're only 2 years old."
"You're only 5, Van, and you're smaller than me."
"Age and body size isn't the problem." Pavina, now 2 years old, was far larger than Vandaloo when it came to body size, not horizontally but vertically. Not only was she large, but she had high attribute values. Her abnormal strength value, in particular, was not something that an ordinary person could compete with. If someone were to have a serious arm wrestle with her, it was fairly likely that their bones would be broken or their hand crushed. In regards to her strength, Vandaloo had sacrificed his own body to raise her, so it was apparent that she could do that without any problems.
"Then why can't I?"
Pavina demanded.
"Your skills,"
replied Vandaloo.
"You haven't learned any yet.
Have you, Pavina?" Skills were more important than attribute values in real battles, unlike arm wrestling. The presence or absence of skills had a great influence on one's fighting strength.
"I've learned the club technique."
"It's still level 1, so you can't."
"Rahapi Sajay is level 1 as well."
Rahapi Sajay groaned and moved her eyeballs to look at Pavina. Just recently, Rahapi Sajay had finally managed to acquire a level 1 skill in unarmed fighting technique. Vandaloo had used human spirits when creating her and had even torn up a spirit mass that was floating about and added them into her. But though she could easily level up skills like physical resistance and superhuman strength, it seemed that it was difficult for her to gain Marshal-type skills. But as her skills were leveling up, her fighting strength would certainly be increasing. She was still rank 4, however. Also, if Rahapi Sajay gets injured, I can just replace her parts, but I can't replace you, can I, Pavina? Indeed, Rahapi Sajay was a patchwork zombie that Vandaloo had created by sewing together multiple corpses. Even if her limbs were broken and her head was cut off, he could cut parts off of suitable corpses and sew them back onto her, and then she would be back to normal. For some reason, not only Pavina but Rahapi Sajay seemed depressed at Vandaloo's words as well. Perhaps she was hurt by being told that it was fine for her to become injured. Vandaloo realized that he could hurt others without being aware of it. He reflected on his actions and words and decided that he would make it up to Rahapi Sajay with some mayonnaise later. But right now, Pavina was the issue at hand. Pavina was... It wasn't clear if she could be called his daughter, but at the very least she was like his little sister. He was hesitant to bring her onto the battlefield and risk her life. She was only 2 years old, after all. Pavina, I'll bring you to fight in wars or dungeons when your skills reach level 5 or when you become an adult. So make sure you train yourself until then. As Vandaloo told her this, he handed her a late birthday present. It was an iron mace to replace the stone one she had been using up until now.
Ah, can I really use this?
Pavina's face lit up in excitement the moment she saw it, and for some reason, Rahapisage seemed happy as well. Yeah, you can, said Vandaloo. It's a present after all.
Thanks! My stone mace was hard to use because it was too light.
Pavina happily started giving the iron mace a few practice swings. Vandaloo gave a satisfied nod as he watched her. He thought of Pavina as his younger sister, but that was exactly why he thought it was his duty to raise her to be able to beat 10 or 20 ordinary soldiers to death. This world was harsh for those of Vita's races like Vandaloo, and there was a high chance that those who believed in Alda would consider Pavina to be on Vita's side if they ever learned of her birth. That was why Pavina needed to become strong. Pavina grunted as she swung her mace around, but why was Rahapisage happily swinging her empty fists in the air as well? As this question perplexed Vandaloo, he suddenly realized something. Rahapisage was imitating Pavina and learning from her. Come to think of it, children like imitating their older siblings, don't they? It seemed that there was no need to make an effort to make more mayonnaise for now.
How to pray to the goddess? What are you saying, holy son? Are you not already sufficiently adhering to Vita's teachings?
This was Nuaza's response when Vandaloo visited him with concerns. Vandaloo had expected that being baptized or using a proper praying method might cause Vita to send him a divine message, so this response was surprising. In all honesty, Vandaloo had no recollection of praying to her properly at all. Though he had rebuilt the Church of Vita, he had never went to it, other than the short visits with everyone before going into a dungeon. Please give me a detailed explanation, Vandaloo requested, about Vita's rules or her doctrine or something.
The doctrine of Vita, the goddess of life and love, is simple, said Nuaza. Celebrate life and others. There are various smaller details, but even so they are not what could be called rules.
Simple teachings, such as don't put your life to waste, and treat your family, friends, and lover with care, apparently formed the foundation of Vita's doctrine. There were various derivations from those fundamental principles. For the life side of things, there were things like don't waste any food in your meals, share your food with the hungry, and give short words of thanks before and after each meal. When Nuaza had said that Vandaloo was adhering to Vita's teachings, he was referring to these, which Vandaloo had been following. Japanese was spoken in this world. That was why Vandaloo had been using the Japanese habits of saying "itadakimasu" and "gochiso-sama" without even thinking about it. And he generally ate anything without being picky. And he was sharing his food with the others in the form of new flavorings that he had created, which were being distributed to everyone. I am indeed following them, said Vandaloo once he realized this. However, the doctrine was strangely similar to Japanese culture. These tendencies were probably present to begin with, and the doctrine might have grown even more similar to Japanese culture after Zakart's arrival 100,000 years ago. But the love part was not very similar to Japanese culture. It seemed that the goddess had quite an assertive nature. What about ceremonies? Asked Vandaloo.
There are none in particular, Nuaza replied. Well, there are wedding ceremonies, divorce announcements, prayer for planting crops, prayers for harvesting them, and coming-of-age ceremonies," he added.
It didn't seem that there were any complicated ceremonies. It was told that the champions had said something along the lines of, "The methods don't really matter. The important thing is not to forget the importance of life and love, isn't it?" What a frank goddess. The simplicity and lack of formality is nice, but from the believer's point of view, isn't there a lack of blessings? Didn't religions normally have strict ceremonies and methods? Well, it likely would not have been a problem 100,000 years ago, when Vita walked safely in this world and could speak to her believers directly. Incidentally, the other gods were apparently mostly the same. But in Shizarion's case, songs and art were offered to him, while sword dances and the heads of prey hunted by warriors were offered as tributes to Xantark. In Ricklant's case, year-long research results were presented before his statue. It seemed that each god had their own preferences.
"As you would expect, Holy Son, Alda and the gods who support him seem to enjoy ceremonies with confusing, complicated procedures,"
said Nuaza. There were apparently many rules, such as the baptism of newborn infants, long prayers, and obligations to go on pilgrimages. This was closer to Vandalu's image of a religion. It was unknown as to whether this was a result of Alda's personality or because his clergymen had come up with these formal ceremonies to keep his believers together now that Alda, like Vita, could no longer walk on this world's surface. But considering that, why does Vita not pay me any attention? Vandalu wondered. Since she had given the prophecy to Nuaza almost 100 years ago, she should have predicted Vandalu's existence back then. With that being the case, Vandalu thought that she could have at least sent him a divine message or something. How to repair the resurrection device in 5 minutes, or the location of other resurrection devices, perhaps.
"Holy Son, the goddess was gravely wounded in her battle against Alda," Nuaza told him. "She cannot send divine messages so frequently. At least, that is what I've been taught."
Vita sustained great wounds during the battle of 100,000 years ago, and apparently Zakhart and the pure-breed vampires were also in a deep slumber. Vita's subordinate gods were in a state where they were completely unable to act as well. Vita's new races had been growing smaller in number due to Alda's influence, leaving her with fewer believers. This was just what Nuaza had heard from scholars from the Orbaum Kingdom, who had visited Talosheim for research purposes, however. And apparently, talent was also needed in order to receive a divine message. With no talent, one would only receive a part of the divine message, or it would not remain in the recipient's memories at all. For example, if a god sent a divine message of, "The man named A is connected to the evil god, so he is dangerous," if the recipient was not talented enough, the only thing he would remember would be A, danger. And then the situation would be complicated, as it would be unknown as to whether A was a dangerous person or whether danger was closing in on A. Well, it might just be that there isn't anything she could tell me through a divine message, Vandalu concluded. It was possible that Vita thought that even if she told Vandalu how to repair the resurrection device, or the locations of other resurrection devices through a divine message, he would not remember any of it.
"But you should be able to acquire the goddess's divine protection one day, Holy Son," said Nuaza.
That would certainly make me feel a lot better, Vandalu whispered as he looked up at the cold winter sunlight. Spring was close. Soldiers, knights, adventurers. If one were to ask which would win in a one-on-one fight disregarding race and sex differences, the answer would be adventurers. It was the job of the soldiers to protect public order of their nations, fight on the battlefields during times of war, and risk their lives to protect the towns when large groups of monsters went on rampages. Unlike the guards of Evbegia, who only borrowed armor and their helmets for bragging rights, soldiers who were not temporary conscripts but formally employed by the army first underwent a job change from apprentice soldier to soldier. These jobs were more or less inferior equivalents to the apprentice warrior and warrior jobs. The only aspects in which they were superior was the ease of leveling and bonuses to their acquisition of the coordination and enhanced attribute values under command skills. However, these skills were meaningless when used alone. The reason that soldier was an inferior equivalent to warrior was because soldiers, unlike adventurers, did not fight frequently. Even if they did uphold the public order, they didn't fight life-threatening battles against criminals every day. And if a town were in a situation where monster rampages occurred multiple times a year, their lives would likely come to an end anyway. Even if one included the skirmishes between the Amid Empire and the Orbom Kingdom that had been ongoing since their foundation, wars only happened once every few years. They trained every day without fail, but they also had much less experience in real battles compared to adventurers. That was why the soldier job was inferior but easier to level up. As knights were expected to possess greater fighting strength than soldiers, their jobs were more powerful than the soldier job. They would begin with apprentice knight and then proceed to equestrian knight. Once they were knighted, they would become true knights. However, not just anyone could become a true knight. Talent was indeed required, but no matter how skilled one was, being hired would be impossible without the trust of a noble family. Knights were also a main source of public order, but depending on the individual, they could also be lords of small regions, such as villages. As such, they spent more time doing desk work than soldiers, and they were more often injured during training than in real battle. The average regular soldier would be considered E-class by Adventurers Guild, and equestrian knights would be similar to them. True knights were said to be equivalent to an above-average D-class adventurer. Thomas Palpapek smiled as he recalled the above information. Anyone witnessing this smile would certainly feel goodwill coming from him. It was a gentle smile that would leave a deep impression. I'm quite good at keeping up appearances, though I do say so myself. On the inside, he wanted to vomit and scowl fiercely, as if he had swallowed a swarm of bitter bugs. It was still a season where sunrises and evenings were cold, but as Thomas looked upon the army that the warm spring sunlight was shining on, he realized that his meager plan had half succeeded and half failed catastrophically. This was Merg, the Merg Shield Nation's royal capital. A departure ceremony for the expedition army was taking place here. The Merg Shield Nation would address the expedition army, and the Amid Empire's supreme commander, General Mavid, would promise military success. Cesare was second in command. He was the second son of the Legston, the current Marshal. Mavid and Cesare would receive blessings from the high priests of Alda, march around in a parade, and then depart. The proud face of General Mavid, the fresh smile of Cesare, and the face of the green wind spear Riley, who was being introduced by the king as the second coming of the hero, were most unpleasant. But there is nothing I can do now. General Mavid had brought several dozen Imperial Guards from the Amid Empire. There were 30 or so priest warriors, led by the renowned vampire hunter, High Priest Gordon, and the rest of the army was 6,000 of the Merg Shield Nation's prided elites. They were elites even among the soldiers, having undergone job changes from soldier to jobs such as archer, cavalryman, and heavy soldier. If they were adventurers, they would be D-class. They were capable of exterminating rank 3 monsters alone, and they showed even greater fighting strength when battling in groups. The knights were all at least true knights, and most of them had undergone job changes to guard knight, holy knight, or superior knight. They would be equivalent to C-class adventurers, and they possessed enough strength to be able to defeat rank 5 monsters on their own. They were normally held back as reserve troops, the Merg Shield Nation's trump card. They were the final line of defense to protect the nation when the Orbomb Kingdom conducted surprise attacks that the soldiers standing by the forts could not deal with, or when large groups of monsters suddenly appeared and went on a rampage. There were 6,000 men here. They were joining an expedition in order to risk their lives in battle that would yield no benefits for the Merg Shield Nation. Even a single one of their deaths would be a great loss. They were not men who could be lost in exchange for cleaning up a worthless stain on the Merg Shield Nation's history, nor could they be compared to the life of a single Dampier. Thomas Palpapek's plan had half succeeded, as the A-class adventurer Riley and his self-made party were participating in the expedition, as well as the vampire hunter High Priest Gordon. The number of men participating in the expedition had been reduced to 2/3 of what had originally been planned. However, in high spirits due to the heroes' participation in the expedition, the king had said, "Our dignity as a military nation would be lost if we do not provide our elite forces," and dispatched 6,000 of the nation's most elite troops. "Oh my, what distinguished personnel we have gathered here, Earl Palpapek." "You are absolutely correct, Viscount Belchese," said Thomas in response to this comment. "Yes, you're damn right, Viscount Belchese." Saying the same words in his mind as with his mouth, though with a completely different tone, Thomas maintained his composure. Viscount Belchese had not done anything wrong. He would have been a fool not to extend his hand at the chance to make his own land prosper, and he wasn't knowledgeable when it came to conspiracies and military affairs. Other than his skills when it came to economics, he was an ordinary nobleman. In any case, he wasn't in a position to be directly involved in this expedition. The most he was doing was helping with the transport of goods. "The expedition is great, but I hope that as many of the soldiers return safely as possible," said Belchese. It was most helpful that he wasn't a foolish nobleman. Helpful for Thomas's sanity in particular. "Yes, they are important. Capable people that this nation needs, after all," replied Thomas. They were the nation's elite. If they were regular soldiers, they could have been replaced by training new recruits for a year. But there was no telling how many years of training it would take for new recruits to become replacements for such elite personnel. And even if they trained, many would not make it that far. This was even more true for knights. We will have 3,000 elite soldiers left in reserve. There are no signs of monster rampages, and the Orbomb Kingdom shouldn't have regained enough strength to go on another offensive. And there should be no way for them to be able to tell what is happening on the other side of the Boundary Mountain Range. Things would likely work out during the expedition. That was what Thomas predicted. "The only thing I can do now is pray that the Dampier is exterminated as quickly as possible, and that as many of our soldiers as possible return before the vampires destroy the tunnel. But it would have been more reassuring if the Thunderclap Schneider was participating in the expedition as well," Belchese commented.
Ah, that S-class adventurer. Of course, Thomas was aware of this person. Unlike Riley, who had been artificially raised to his current position, he was a true hero, and he had visited the Merg Shield Nation on several occasions. He hunted dragons whose ranks were higher than 10, as if it were nothing, and noble-born vampires were nothing but small fry before him. He was a superhuman who had defeated an evil god and annihilated numerous packs of Lamias and Skyla. A truly inhuman being. He was one of the 5 strongest individuals in the Amid Empire, a hero. It was even said that Alda had sent divine messages more than once or twice in order to warn of his life being in danger. If he didn't have bad habits as well, Balchese muttered. Schneider had an unrivaled lust for women. It is unfortunate, Thomas agreed, but they do say that heroes like their women. It doesn't matter if the goddess loves him. Anyone who would be infatuated with womanizing in a time like this should just die. Though the words that came out of his mouth were civil, Thomas cursed Schneider in his mind. Processing was a skill that allowed different matters to be thought about simultaneously. It was likely that it provided Vandaloo with the same ability as dividing his heads. After trying to use it, he found that he was able to think about different things as if he had grown an additional brain. He would be able to use thought process A to solve mathematics problems, while thought process B controlled his body in a boxing match. The number of thought processes was not limited by the level of the skill. He was able to have 3 or 4 at once. But the more the number increased, the more likely the thought processes were to fail when performing complicated tasks. As the level of skill increased, it was likely that he would be able to perform more numerous, complicated tasks at once. Incidentally, when Vandaloo used out-of-body experience to multiply his heads, his extra heads could also use parallel thought processing.
High-powered as usual, Zadiris commented. Combined with the chant revocation skill, can you not cast multiple spells at once?
I can, said Vandaloo.
If I use multicast as well, I can currently cast 6 spells with one head.
Even with the parallel thought processing skill to increase the number of Vandaloo's thought processes, he only had one mouth, so he would normally be able to only cast one spell. However, with the chant revocation spell, there was no need to recite an incantation, so casting multiple spells simultaneously was possible. The multicast skill only added to that, and he could cast even more with the use of Surpass Limits skill.
Would your mana not decrease if you did that? Asked Taria.
Not particularly, though it is tiring, replied Vandaloo.
Was it not likely consuming a large amount of the glucose in his body? For Vandaloo, who possessed a vast amount of mana, he would not particularly be happy if his body's nutrients were the price to pay for using his skills. But if he used out-of-body experience and used only his soul rather than his body to use skills, there would be no problem. As for what Vandaloo was doing right now, he was playing shogi with Zadiris and Taria as his opponents.
Despite seeming simple at first, it is quite a strategically deep game, Zadiris remarked.
It seems like it would also be quite enjoyable if one were to get used to it, said Taria. Reversi had already become widespread, so Vandaloo had created a board and pieces for shogi out of stone, as another way for those in Talosheim to entertain themselves. He had considered chess as well, but since Japanese was spoken in this world, shogi seemed more appropriate. Additionally, it seemed likely that everyone would soon become familiar with shogi, as currently existing board games were far more complicated and difficult.
And most importantly, Vandaloo himself was not very familiar with chess. He did remember the shapes of the pieces, how they moved, and the basic rules of the game, however. But it was something that he had been forced to play for intelligence tests in Origin, so his knowledge of the game might have been different from the rules of chess on Earth. There were pieces called mages in the game he knew too. Vandaloo was processing the board states of 2 games at once, and each of his hands moved a different piece on each board with clacking noises. He was spending his time leisurely after having cleared a dungeon, but it was also training for his parallel thought processing.
Come to think of it, how was the virus you created?
Asked Zadiris. Clack.
It went well,
Vandaloo replied.
It only manifested symptoms in the dinosaurs and goblins that everyone worked together to capture alive.
Click, clack. Then, once you remember a number of magic items imbued with sterilization, everything will be perfect, won't they? Asked Tarja.
Click, clack.
And then Vandaloo could see that it would be difficult for him to move and advance his pieces.
I've been defeated, he said,
exhaling quietly.
Also, it's a rule that you have to declare when you are putting your opponent in check.
Boy, Zadiris looked up at him.
It is fine for you to be more frustrated when you lose, you know. Zadiris, I've already lost 10 times in a row. I don't have any pride left.
Like Reversi, Vandaloo had never played shogi with someone on Earth. His only experience with shogi had been in video games and playing by himself. Therefore, like in Reversi, he had been unable to defeat the rapidly improving Zadiris. And though he had won against Tarja 3 times, he had been losing continuously after that. Tarja gave a small laugh.
Well then, please go ahead. Well, it is a competition after all, said Zadiris.
There were rules in place where the loser of matches had to give massages to the winner, and though Vandaloo was not aware of this, the skill of giving others massages was not widespread in Lambda. Naturally, the concept of acupuncture points did not exist. The wealthy and those who made use of high-class brothels knew of massages as anma, but they had no concept of using acupuncture points, seitai, needles, and moxibustion. Thus, the massage golems that Vandaloo had placed in the bathhouses were plainly great inventions.
Well then, I'll get started, said Vandaloo.
He used his spirit form transformation on his arms, branched them out into tentacle-like shapes, and they sank into Zadiris's and Tarja's bodies. From the inside, he released their muscle tension while using materialization to massage them from the outside. The materialization skill he had gained when acquiring the Soul Breaker job, to put it simply, was a skill that allowed him to materialize parts of his body that had undergone spirit form transformation. It might seem that taking the effort to use spirit form transformation only to materialize the body parts again would be meaningless, but Vandaloo had intuitively sensed that it would be an extremely useful skill, though not because he thought that he would be able to do tentacle play. Tarja called out to Vandaloo,
"Van-sama, you have become distracted."
"Ah, sorry." It seemed that concentrating on 3 things with parallel thought processing caused his focus to slip sometimes and produce negative effects on what he was doing.
"Boy, you are so enthusiastic when it comes to Bastia and the others, but not taking things seriously for us. How shocking," said Zadiris.
"It seems that he does indeed prefer the younger women," Tarja lamented.
"No, both of you are young," Vandaloo pointed out.
Though both of their ages were 300 years, if rounded up, now that they had undergone youth transformation, their bodies had reverted to being very close to their physical age. When Vandaloo looked closely at them as they made their lamentations, he could see slight smiles on their faces. It seemed that they were aware of this.
Come to think of it, it's been about 3 years since I used youth transformation on Zadiris, and about a year for Tarja.
Vandaloo increased the number of his arms.
Wait, what are you planning to do with so many arms?
Zadiris demanded.
I was thinking I should do a little something to turn you into young women,
replied Vandaloo. That is unnecessary, Tarja said hastily.
We are no longer tired, so you can end the massage here.
As Zadiris and Tarja's faces turned pale with panic, Vandaloo refused to allow them to escape and began using youth transformation.
No, you don't need to be so reserved, he insisted. Stop! Ah! No, there are even more of them than before! Ah!
Vandaloo was bothered by the fact that he had lost the shogi matches, so he used youth transformation on Zadiris and Tarja until their skin was as smooth and childish as a baby's.
The levels of parallel thought processing and materialization skills have increased. You have acquired the high-speed thought process skill.